Outrage in Madrid. Thousands unite against plans to pardon Catalonia's convicted separatists. Will the pressure force Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez to rethink his proposal? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Spain's polarizing pardons. In 2017, a vote on independence declared illegal by the Spanish Constitutional Court was held in Catalonia. 9 of the separatist movement's leaders were sentenced to prison for organizing that referendum. 3 others were found guilty of disobedience and handed a fine. But less than 2 years later, Spain's socialist Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says he's considering pardoning all of them. It's a risky political gamble, and the streets of the capital show it just might backfire. Thousands are accusing Sanchez of caving in to his Catalan coalition partners. Leaders from 3 right-wing parties, including Vox, feature prominently in the demonstrations. A recent poll shows more than 60% of the country is against the pardons, but Sanchez says he's aware the decision could prove unpopular.
I understand that there may be compatriots, citizens in Catalonia and in the country as a whole, who feel misgivings about the possibility of granting pardons to Catalan prisoners. But I ask them to have confidence, because we have to make a commitment to coexistence.
So, should the convicted separatist leaders be pardoned, and at what political cost? Well, joining me now to debate that from Madrid is Vox National Bureau member Iván Espinosa de los Monteros. Carlos Conde Solares is in Newcastle. He's a senior lecturer in Hispanic Studies at Northumbria University. And from Cardiff is Andrew Dowling, author of The Rise of Catalan Independence, Spain's Territorial Crisis. Thank you all 3 really so much for joining us. Iván, I'm going to start with you and why you think Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is actually doing this. And if you could also explain the implications of a pardon rather than just early release from prison.
Thank you, Andrea. First of all, the only reason why the president is doing this at this time is because his government, his coalition government, is being supported by parties to which these people belong. So there's really no elevated motive. It's really a question of self-reliance, of surviving in this very changing environment in politics. And all he's doing really is pardoning himself for having the support of these people. Now, this is an extremely bad idea. First of all, because it's going against the rule of law, and any nation should be subject to the rule of law. Now, our Supreme Court has ruled against this presidential pardon. Doesn't mean he can't do it. He could, and he's going to do it. It just means that it might be illegal. Now, our lawyers at the Vox Party are going to be watching very closely how this happens, because as we've already said, if he does, in effect, take this forward, we will be taking him to court as a president and the rest of the government who approves this measure, which we think is contrary to our Constitution and contrary to rule of law. So it's a very dangerous move. And I think people across Spain, as we saw this past Sunday, are very much against this.
Okay. Andrew Dowling, is it a short-sighted move for political survival? And is it worth, if that's the case, is it worth the political consequences?
Well, I think the first thing we do is that we kind of compromise with our political opponents. We don't compromise with our political friends. So I actually think on the part of the Spanish government, this is a recognition that the Catalan crisis has been the greatest crisis faced by Spain since the early 1980s. It's been the biggest issue confronting Spain for 40 years. And it's actually an act of statesmanship on the part of the Spanish government to say, yes, we're going to try to reduce tensions with Catalonia, where close to half of the population no longer want to be part of Spain. The other half do, but you have to recognise that up to about 48%, sometimes 50% of Catalans no longer want to be part of Spain. So it's a mature decision saying that we have to kind of like compromise. We have to try to solve one of Spain's most serious political problems.
Okay, Iván, I could see you almost starting to roll your eyes there, but hold on, Andrew, I just need to ask you, One further addendum to that question. I said, is it worth the political consequences? But actually, I should ask, is it worth the potential legal consequences that Yvonne was talking about?
Well, it's within the purview. It's within the purview of the Spanish government to pass these measures. I mean, there may be legal challenges, but I think one of the things that's happening, including in the case of Vox, it's quite amusing actually to hear them speaking about their defence of the Spanish Constitution when they're universally seen by experts in politics in Europe and around the world as representative of an extreme right or far right ideology. So they kind of pick and choose elements of the Spanish Constitution that they think are worth defending, but they have no political solution to the Catalan problem other than say we need hard measures to crush these Catalan separatists, which basically is why we've got to the situation we're in, because of the hard line of the Spanish right wing caused the problem in the first place. Going back to when Catalonia was given new powers, going back to 2006, they collected petitions, they organised petitions, they collected signatures. And in 2011, for example, support for Catalan independence was 12%. At the end of the right-wing government of 2018, it was 48-50%. So the only message that the Spanish right has, let's make the situation worse and try to capitalize on it.
Okay, Yvonne, I'll let you respond.
Well, first of all, I'm not even going to dignify comments made by somebody who I don't even know who he is. I represent the third largest political force in Spain. I represent the party that took to the courts, that took this case to the courts, who made it possible to convict these people who've committed very serious crimes. Now, second of all, there is no conflict between Catalonia and the rest of Spain. There is a very serious conflict between 9 people who had political power and used it to their advantage and the courts in Spain. Now, these people have been tried by the Supreme Court in Spain, which I think is a pretty fair institution. We took them to the court. We asked for very serious punishments, and we were not granted everything we wanted. In fact, we believe the sentencing was quite gentle, considering that they went to extremes in what they have been convicted for, which is embezzlement and sedition, which is a very serious crime. Sedition is inciting people to a rebellion. It's a very serious crime, no matter where you are in the world. If it's a serious country, people are not allowed to steal public funds to form a rebellion. And if they do, then they have to say that they have to see their day in court. Now, they have been convicted and they've been sentenced to very light sentences. And now they want to be taken to the street for the only reason that they are supporting this government. This is not about Catalans. Catalans have nothing to do with this point. This is about 9 people who have been in political power and who have used and misused their power and public funds to support the independence cause, committing very serious crimes. And that's all there is to it. There's really no much more to say about it.
Okay. Carlos, I actually want to get you in the mix at this point. I mean, is it right for Yvonne to say that this conflict is actually just between these convicted politicians and the law? It's not between Catalonia and the rest of Spain, and that most Catalan people would agree with that?
I think that this is a conflict that quite often needs to be reframed for the purpose of making it understandable for foreign audiences. I would say that we have to remember that the public authority in Catalonia is the regional government. In this case, the independentists, the nationalist Catalan government. That is the public authority, and they have powers over absolutely everything from education to the media, is the nationalist administration, not the Spanish government. So this is not a conflict between the Spanish administration and the Catalan people. What we have here is something that's quite different. We have a public authority in Catalonia, which is in control of every walk of life, and one that has, in my view, abused its powers and brought the situation to a position in which, for instance, they passed the so-called transitional laws in 2017. This is quite serious. This is quite unprecedented as well in the context of the European Union. They stripped non-nationalist citizens of their civil and political rights, and this is something that is quite often ignored in political commentary. They have turned the public authority into a tool with which to erode legality, into a tool that they have used in order to, they have turned it into a tool for committing illegalities. Now, they have shown no
Okay.
remorse and no contrition about it whatsoever, and in my view, they have been a populist threat against the rule of law in the context of the European Union. Now, these pardons are, I think, very unlikely to improve coexistence, and quite the opposite. In fact, they are likely to reinforce this polarization, and in fact, this is something that is done, I think,
Okay.
exclusively out of political convenience on the part of Pedro Sanchez's government.
Okay. It's important to stress as well what you just alluded to there, and that the Spanish Supreme Court actually issued a report saying that the sentences were appropriate, and that those convicted had not shown the slightest evidence or faintest hint of contrition. In other words, they have shown absolutely no regret. So at this point, Andrew, I'll let you respond. I saw you had some feelings on several points made there. And also, I mean, please address the fact that you actually think these sentences were far too harsh.
Yeah, well, I do think they were harsh. And I think one of the things that that I've seen over the years is that, and I speak to lots of foreign journalists and commentators about this, and the universal impression I have from speaking to foreign journalists is that the sentencing was incredibly harsh for what was and is a political conflict. Over the years, I've been certainly critical of aspects of Catalan independence. I've spoken critically on this program, and it is a political issue. We're talking about this today. These are not common criminals, okay? This is not about kind of like a crime, a burglary, or something like this. Yes, they've been sentenced by the courts, but the whole context, the whole issue is political. And therefore, the Spanish government has made a political decision to try to reduce the tension that has built in Spain over the past few years, that kind of reached an extreme in one sense over the years 2017, 2018 and 2019, and its attempt to try to partly solve a political problem. And you do that, as I mentioned at the beginning, you solve a political problem by compromising. You compromise with your political opponents. You don't compromise with your political friends.
Okay.
That's just a very simple mechanism of doing politics.
And Andrew, you feel that has worked in cases before, including that of Northern Ireland?
Well, absolutely. People in the case of Northern Ireland, where there was, horrific violence, were released from prison, and they had committed horrific acts. So that's kind of like almost a universal law of politics, that you have to kind of find some common ground. You have to make compromises and really not make the situation worse. And again, I'd come back to Ivan and his party Vox. How do their actions help solve the greatest political crisis Spain has faced for the past 40 years, with just kind of going on and on and on without ever saying, what is it? What is it? It's like in a divorce. If somebody says, I don't want to be with you anymore, do you try to persuade them to stay, or do you say, I'm going to lock you in the room, you're not allowed to leave? What are the aspects that Vox would be prepared to persuade half of the Catalan population who no longer feel Spanish? What are the concrete measures? I specifically ask Ivan, what are those measures to encourage Catalans to return to the Spanish fatherland?
Go ahead, Ivan.
Well, Andrew, I think you're mixing a lot of different things here. One of the main arguments you keep repeating is you compromise with your opponents, not with your allies. Well, that sounds good. That's exactly the opposite of what they're doing here, because the president is compromising with his allies. The reason why he's compromising, the reason why he's giving in, is because they're supporting him in his government in the first place. They're not his opponents. They're his allies. So there's no point in you saying that you need to compromise with your opponents. As to what Vox will do, well, tell you what, Vox has been around for only 2 years, whereas the Socialists and the Popular Party have been around for 40. So it's going to be a little hard for us to solve this problem in just a couple of years. But let me tell you, we're going to do a lot to make sure that the entire Catalan population feels a bit better about belonging to Spain. And if you may, just let me finish. Now, one of the things we're going to make sure is that people like you become a little bit better informed, because you're incredibly misinformed.
I don't know anything
and
about
you
Spain.
are, yes, you are. And you're also incredibly arrogant, because I never cut you off when you were talking. You're incredibly misinformed, and you are misinforming people as well. There is no need to bring the Catalans back to Spain, because they never left. There is, in fact, half of the Catalan population who doesn't feel comfortable in the current situation. By the way, this has happened because of the separatist politicians who've been using public funds to support this line of thought, right? And tell you what, half of the population has not been jailed. This is not about people having freedom of speech of freedom of expression. I'm here in Congress. I just came out of a session. I'll be hopping right back in, where there's a lot of separatists in our Congress who keep saying things every day that I don't like, and that does not constitute a crime. It's not about what they think. It's not about what they say. It's about very serious crimes they have been committing while they were in power. It's not about freedom of speech. They're allowed to say and defend whatever it is they want to say. But in Spain, if you break the law, you go to jail, no matter if you're a politician or a common man. No privileges should be given to politicians just for the fact that they're politicians.
Okay, Andrew, I know you'd like to respond, but I really do want to get Carlos back in the conversation here. I mean, first of all, if you could go back, and do you accept that there are parallels, for example, with the Northern Ireland situation that Andrew was citing, because it seemed like a strong case. Do you see this as the same situation in Spain?
No, I think this probably is an oversimplification of what's happening in Catalonia, because in the case of Northern Ireland, we had a clear conflict there between the IRA and the paramilitaries, and well, it was a completely different thing. Now, what tends to happen with, in particular, I would say, a lot of Anglo-Saxon commentators about the Spanish situation is that they tend to compare it with what they know best, which is the Northern Irish case, which is the Scottish case, and all the rest. But I think it's much more useful to actually go and speak to the people in the ground. And I don't mean the political elite. I don't mean the politicians. And we know very well that those people tend to have a very pro-nationalist type of approach. But speak to half of Catalonia, the ones that are not being listened to, because we've been talking about the compromise, but the past 40 years in Spain have been a constant compromise that always goes in the same direction, which is to favor the nationalists in Catalonia. And the half of Catalonia, the Spanish speakers, for instance, who are having their rights trampled upon by the local administration, well, no one is listening to them. Now, when they talk about about dialogue with Catalonia, they don't talk about dialogue with those people who are not who are under constant nationalist pressure, and they have been over the past 40 years. Now, those people are Catalans as well, and the Catalan administration should govern for all of Catalonia and not just for the independentists. Let's remember, and I'm going to remind your viewers of this again, of the seriousness of what took place in 2017 with the so-called transitional laws. That is, transitional laws by means of which the executive power decided to give itself absolute power to decide over the lives of those in Catalonia. This is very serious stuff. And it is not something that I think can be treated in a frivolous manner. It is very serious for the people who were in Catalonia, and many of whom were thinking about exile. Many of them were thinking about leaving, and many of them feared for their own safety and for the lives of themselves and their children as well. I mean, this was a very serious attempt at breaking the law and breaking coexistence in Catalonia.
Andrew, I need you to put forth, I guess, your defense here. And if you could stress, because, you know, Pedro Sanchez has said that, and you seem to agree, that this is what he believes is necessary to actually heal Spain. He wants to reestablish coexistence, as he put it. But how will it reestablish coexistence when these separatists still want to separate from Spain and effectively divide the country?
Yeah, well, 80% of the Catalan population in all polling over the past 3 years has shown support for the release of the prisoners. I think the actual the prisoner issue has kind of united most Catalans. There was a demonstration against the pardons in Barcelona last Friday, and it managed to bring together 200 people. So you have a really strong support in Catalonia for the pardons. And as I say, I reiterate this, you have a situation of political conflict. I agree to some extent that's a situation of political conflict in Catalonia, but you also have a political conflict between the capital of Catalonia, Barcelona, and Madrid. And, you know, I reiterate what I've said throughout my contributions in this program, that you have to find common ground. You have to find compromise to solve political problems. It's happened throughout history, and it is the only way to solve an intense political problem. It's, you know, it's very simple. It's really a basic notion. You solve political problems by sitting down, talking, negotiating, find common ground. That's really all I have to say on the issue.
Right, but then, I mean, it sounds so rational, what you're saying, but then why is it that 65% of the Spanish public disagrees with these pardons?
Because attachment to Spanish unity is very deep and very profound. It's deeply rooted. It's a very emotional issue. Spaniards, in one sense, were, in many Spaniards were kind of traumatized by the events of the autumn 2017. This is a very deep thing. And I think if you compare it, for example, with the United Kingdom, most English people don't really care, for example, if Northern Ireland becomes part of the Republic, joins Irish unification. In fact, most supporters of Brexit and most supporters of English nationalism don't really care if Scotland becomes independent. But that is not the case in Spain. Attachment to Spanish nationalism, you see in the footage, strong expressions of Spanish nationhood are really deep and really emotional. And that's why, even some of this discussion is quite intense, because this is a deeply emotive, deeply emotional issue.
Yvonne, go ahead.
Well, I tend to disagree. This is a very rational issue. People are allowed to think whatever they like. And we have them in Congress every day saying things that I never agree with and I never will agree with. But that's part of freedom and that's part of democracy. You get to defend your ideas through the right course. You have a parliament, you have the media, you have all sorts of ways to express your ideas, and you have all sorts of ways if you want to change the Constitution, for instance, which is one of the things that would be necessary for them to separate. Now, if you want to separate, which is not easy, I understand it's not easy. That's why we've been together for over, a few centuries. There's ways to do it. There's a constitutional way to do it. What is not tolerable, what will never be allowed by any reasonable, rational politician anywhere in the world, is for a few politicians to break the law to their convenience. And by the way, those who live in Catalonia live under the oppression of these politicians who are not so flexible, who have no capacity whatsoever to have dialogue with those who think differently. For instance, if you're a Spanish speaker, which you would be if you're a Spaniard in Catalonia, you will never find a school where you can take your kids to where they are taught in Spanish. How's that? You can teach them, you can take them to school and they can learn in English and French, in Hebrew, they can learn in Italian, they can learn in German, they can learn in Catalan. You can't learn in Spanish. And the Catalan politicians have not been very tolerant of Spanish speakers in Catalonia, which, by the way, are most of them, including most of the people who live in Barcelona. So if dialogue is to be brought into the picture, if you need to be reaching a commitment with those who think differently, which I agree, that's exactly what needs to be done in the Catalan region. And by the way, that's exactly what we're here to do. And that's why Vox is the leading party of the opposition in Catalonia, and we're the third party in Spain. And yes, we will take some time. It won't be easy. It won't be a fine and an easy and quick measure. It's going to take some time, but that's the way politics works.
Okay. Carlos, it's interesting to hear Andrew describe how Spaniards are very attached to their national identity, but then we hear Yvonne describing just how nationalistic the Catalan people actually are, just the pro-independence one in particular, to the point that they won't even allow, in a sense, the Spanish language to be used in public schools. I mean, Carlos, I'll finish then with you. How do you see this actually getting resolved if those Catalan nationalists are as motivated as ever to continue their movement?
Well, it won't get resolved by doing the same thing that we have been doing for the past 40 years, which is to try to do so by means of concessions to the nationalist elite of Catalonia. I think that compromise needs to be found, but that compromise needs to involve that that half of Catalonia that is not of a nationalist persuasion. When it comes to the emotional nature of the debate, there's nothing more emotional in Spain than peripheral nationalism. That is, after the Francoist regime, it is in fact quite rare to witness public expressions of Spanish patriotism. Quite the opposite. One could attempt, for instance, to go out with a Spanish flag, for instance, now during the Euros in Bilbao or in Barcelona, and one would probably fear for their own safety. That is, the issue of nationalism is much more emotional in the peripheral regions. Now, having said that, okay. Are we going to resolve this by means of doing the same thing? There's basically nothing left to concede to that Catalan elite, to that Catalan nationalist elite. And indeed, as Ivan was mentioning before, the issue with not being able to study in Spanish in Catalonia is not just in breach of the civil rights of those children, of those citizens. but also it is in breach of the judicial rulings that that the Generalitat de Catalunya should be abiding for. I mean, that is this is a very clear very clear example of the public authority not abiding by the rule of law.
Okay.
And I think there's no compromise when your public authority does not want to abide by the rule of law. That is, you're going to have to, and this is a very personal thing, you're going to have to make them comply with the rule of law.
Okay.
And I don't think that the pardons are going to encourage them to do that.
Okay, Carlos Conde Solares, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for joining us, and to our viewers, of course, as well. We'll see you next time.